Now, Dr. Panache Chigumadza is a notable historian and author recognized for her significant contributions to the study of African history and literature. One of her acclaimed works, These Bones Will Rise Again, delves into the complexities of identity, culture and memory within the context of African history. Through her writing, Chigumadza not only reflects on the historical narratives of the African continent, but also emphasizes the importance of language in shaping those narratives. She was one of the speakers at the UJ seminar, The Rise of African Novel and African Language. We had a sit down with her, and this is what she said about the importance of writing in African language.
Historian of the 19th century and the author of These Bones Will Rise Again, Dr. Panache Chigumadzi is in the country. She was one of the speakers at the UJ seminar, The Rise of African Novel and African Languages. The seminar was about the history of African writers who wrote in indigenous languages. We speak to her about the preservation of African languages, as well as the importance of having a platform for Black women to share their voices and tell their stories.
Thank you for having me, first of all. We really had a wonderful seminar yesterday at the University of Johannesburg, the rise of the African or the modern African novel and African languages, and particularly looking at African languages in the 19th century. And part of why I'd been asked to speak at the event alongside Professor Mukoma Wangugi was specifically because my research, my doctoral research as a historian, is on the 19th century African language press and the discourse of Ubuntu at that time. But specifically, as I do that work on the rise of the 19th century African language press, is looking at the fact that South Africa has the world's oldest African language press, beginning in 1837, with Shumaeli Wendaba, for example, which is the preacher of news. And there's a long history of Black people writing in African languages for Black audiences. Those of you who follow some of these things would know the likes of the Lovedale Press. They had newspapers such as Isigidimi Samaklosa, for example, the Christian Express, where a lot of Black intellectuals were writing and debating the issues of the day, writing across many forms and genres, writing poetry, writing debates in African languages. And so that's really important part of our history, our intellectual history as Black people. And part of the argument that we were putting forth yesterday at the seminar on understanding African literature is that typically within the popular history, popular understanding of African novels, there would be a way of beginning to locate the genesis, if you want to call it, of African literature, so-called modern African literature, with the 1960s, with books like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, looking at conferences like the 1962 Makerere Conference for African Writers of English Expression, and that begins to be the genesis of African writing, and people then look from Things Fall Apart onwards as the history of African literature. But we're saying, in fact, if you go back to the 19th century, there's a whole very, very long history, a rich history of Black writing in African languages. And that is important for us to understand so that we're not operating with a truncated or a limited historical consciousness or a literary imagination. There's a long history of writing in the newspapers, which then set the stage for the first African novels, which were in fact in African languages. We're looking at Thomas Mofolo, for example, writing, Traveler to the East, which was first published in Setswana in 1907. We're looking at books like Esike Mqai's Itala Lamawele, meaning The Trial of the Twins, which was published in 1912, a whole range of writing that was done in African languages already by, again, taking on the foundation in the 19th century and beginning in the early 20th century. So it's absolutely essential for us, if we're serious about our future, even thinking about the past or our present, we must have a full view of what our literary history has been, and that's part of what we were discussing yesterday.
What do you think the current state of literature traces back to the 1800s? What are some of the experiences that the young authors are having, that the older authors didn't have.
Writing is not the only mark of intellection. And that's really important to say, because these writers in the 19th century, people like Tio Soga, for example, who's pretty well known, at least with those who do the history of 19th century writing, people like William Wellington Qopa, they were very much part of the milieu, the societies that they came from. They were listening to the kind of debates that people were having, and that's what they happened to use writing. Writing was just yet another tool for a long history. So, for example, we think about the greatest writer in isiXhosa is someone like Esikhe Nqayi, who really showed the ways in which both the oral tradition and the written tradition came together in one person. He was really known and renowned as Imbongi, for example, but it was both one who wrote and also one who spoke. So both the performances, those of you who've read Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela speaks about how listening to him perform, reading his work as well, was really important for his own intellectual development. Now, what's really important is, I think, very often, and as you raised, that we think about the language question as primarily an identity issue, when really we have to think about it as a structural issue. We have to think about the material conditions under which people are doing the writing and which languages begin to gain authority or don't gain authority. So what do I mean by that? We think about the fact that it took until 2020 until the first judgment, legal judgment, was written in isiXhosa, in an African language, which is pretty shameful. This was by the current Chief Justice, wrote it in isiXhosa. In fact, defending the right of Afrikaans to be used, which in itself was a different debate, but the key point being that it takes 200 years or just under 200 years for isiXhosa, or an African language, to be used in that way in the court of law as a language of authority. Now that has something to tell us about which languages do or don't have authority in a black majority country where the vast majority of people speak African languages. And yet our languages are not understood as scientific languages. Every other year when we hear that, oh, a PhD has been written in isiXhosa, a PhD has been written in isiZulu, I'm not sure if that has happened yet, but isiXhosa in particular, there's a huge celebration, as if we're surprised that African languages can hold knowledge and can hold science.
You are tapping into a space where you want to write in your own language, and you want to learn more about the history of your own language, and you have to tell stories in your own language so that you preserve your language for the future generation. Do you think we are doing more of that now as opposed to them back then?
There's the long debates that particularly became very famous or most vociferous and loud when we had Chinua Achebe and Mukoma, or rather Ngugi wa Thiong'o, debating the language question, right? Where we know famously Ngugi wa Thiong'o speaks about the need for African languages, right? And African languages is incredibly important, and he begins to write in his own languages, and then subsequently, writes it first in his language, in Gikuyu, and thereafter translates. Whereas the likes of, and of course it's a very broad strokes way of understanding this, the likes of Chinua Achebe are arguing that even the likes of English have become African languages, and thinking about how we can make those languages our own versus the kind of argument that the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o are making around the need for us to take our languages seriously.